The last thing Bianca needed today was a flat tire. Standing on the side of the road, she stared at the deflated rubber like it had personally betrayed her. She was already running late for her second job, and now this. The universe really had it out for her. She yanked her phone from her pocket, only to see the dreaded no service in the corner of the screen. Of course, because why wouldn't today get worse? She inhaled deeply, closing her eyes for a moment, trying to will away the frustration bubbling inside her. She had two choices: stand here and wallow in her bad luck, or figure it out herself. Just as she rolled up her sleeves, ready to attempt fixing it on her own, a sleek black Maserati slowed to a stop beside her. The window rolled down, revealing a man who looked like he belonged on the cover of a financial magazine's sharp jawline, piercing blue eyes, and an air of confidence that made her stomach flip. "You look like you need a hand," he said, stepping out of the car. Bianca narrowed her eyes. "I can handle it." The man tilted his head, as if deciding whether to challenge her stubbornness. "I don't doubt that," he said smoothly, "but why struggle when I can help?" She hesitated. She wasn't the type to accept handouts, especially not from a man who looked like he had never struggled a day in his life. His suit alone probably cost more than her rent. Still, she was late and exhausted. "Fine," she muttered, crossing her arms, "but if you expect me to owe you something, don't bother." The man chuckled, crouching down beside the tire. "I don't need anything from you." His fingers moved swiftly, effortlessly loosening the bolts. He worked like someone who didn't need to change tires but somehow knew how anyway. Bianca stole a glance at him. There was something about him, something unreadable beneath the polished exterior. "So, do you rescue stranded women on the highway often?" she asked, arching a brow. He looked up, his lips twitching. "Not usually, but when I see someone in trouble, I stop." She studied him, skeptical. "That's unusual." He shrugged, securing the spare tire in place. "Maybe." A few minutes later, he wiped his hands on a cloth from his car. "You're good to go." Bianca glanced at her fixed tire, then back at him. "Thanks." "Zane," he supplied. "Bianca." Zane nodded, stepping toward his car. But before he could leave, she blurted out, "Let me buy you coffee or something, as a thank you." He paused, amusement flickering in his gaze. "Are you always this stubborn about returning favors?" "Yes." Zane seemed to consider for a moment before nodding. "All right, Bianca, coffee it is." She didn't know then that a simple flat tire would change her entire life. Bianca led Zane to a small cafe tucked between an old bookstore and a flower shop. It wasn't fancy, but it was cozy, the kind of place where the barista knew your order before you even reached the counter. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries filled the air as they stepped inside. Zane glanced around, his sharp eyes scanning the rustic decor, the mismatched chairs, the handwritten menu on the chalkboard. He looked out of place in his tailored suit, but if he felt uncomfortable, he didn't show it. Bianca ordered quickly, handing the cashier a few crumpled bills before Zane could protest. He arched an eyebrow at her, but said nothing as they found a seat by the window. "You didn't have to do that," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I told you, I don't like owing people," Bianca replied, stirring her coffee. Zane studied her for a moment, as if trying to decipher something hidden beneath her words. "You always this independent." "Always," she said without hesitation. "People tend to disappoint you when you rely on them too much." His expression shifted slightly, something unreadable flickering behind his gaze. "Not everyone," he murmured. Bianca wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she focused on her coffee instead. A comfortable silence settled between them, interrupted only by the distant sound of the espresso machine and the chatter of other patrons. "So what do you do?" Zane finally asked, breaking the quiet. Bianca hesitated before answering. I work at a diner, and I pick up extra shifts wherever I can. Something about the way he looked at her made her feel exposed, like he could see beyond the surface. You work a lot. Some of us don't have a choice, she said simply. Zane didn't press further, but she could tell he was thinking. And you, she asked, shifting the focus, what do you do? He took a slow sip of his coffee before answering, I run a company. That's vague, Bianca pointed out. He gave a small shrug. I own a few businesses, investments, real estate, that kind of thing. She studied him, realizing now why he carried himself the way he did, like a man used to control, to power. So you're rich, she said bluntly. Zane didn't confirm or deny it. I do well. Bianca exhaled through her nose. Figures. He tilted his head. What does that mean? Nothing, she said, waving a hand. Just, I don't usually cross paths with people like you. And what kind of person am I? She thought about it. The kind who doesn't have to worry about flat tires or late paychecks. Zane didn't react the way she expected. Instead of getting defensive or amused, he simply nodded, as if acknowledging the truth in her words. I wasn't always where I am now, he said after a moment. That caught her off guard. No. No, he confirmed, but hard work changes things. Bianca wasn't sure why, but that answer settled something inside her. She leaned back in her chair, studying him in a new light. Maybe Zane wasn't just some detached millionaire passing through her world for a moment. Maybe there was more to him than she initially thought. And maybe, just maybe, she wanted to find out what that was. A week passed, and Bianca didn't expect to see Zane again. Their coffee had been a momentary crossing of paths, two strangers from different worlds, sharing a conversation that should have ended when they walked out of that cafe. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Bianca was in the middle of her shift at the diner, balancing a tray of coffee cups while weaving between tables when the door swung open. The low hum of conversation didn't falter, but something in the air shifted. A presence. A quiet authority. She turned her head and nearly dropped her tray. Zane stood just inside the entrance, scanning the room with the same sharp, assessing gaze he'd had the first time they met. He wasn't in a suit today, but he still looked effortlessly put together: dark jeans, a crisp black shirt, and an undeniable air of confidence. Her heart did something strange in her chest, an unexpected jolt that she quickly suppressed. What are you doing here? She asked the moment she reached him, her voice low but firm. He looked down at her with an unreadable expression. Having lunch. Bianca folded her arms. You don't seem like the type to eat at places like this. His lips tilted slightly. Maybe I wanted to try something different. She didn't buy it, not for a second, but she didn't have time to argue. Sit wherever you want, she muttered before turning back to her tables. For the next hour, Zane stayed. He ordered a simple meal, barely touched it, and instead spent most of his time watching her. Not in an intrusive way, but in a way that made her hyper-aware of every move she made. By the time her break rolled around, she found herself sliding into the booth across from him, arms resting on the table. All right, she said, leveling him with a look. Why are you really here? Zane leaned forward slightly. Maybe I wanted to see you again. Bianca blinked, thrown off by the directness of his words. She had expected deflection, a casual excuse, not this. Why? She asked before she could stop herself. His eyes held hers, steady and unwavering. You intrigue me. She wasn't sure how to respond to that. No one had ever said something like that to her before, especially not a man like him. I don't think I'm that interesting, she said finally. Zane's gaze didn't waver. You're wrong. A strange warmth spread through her, unsettling and unfamiliar. She exhaled, shaking her head. You're persistent, you know that. I've been told, he admitted. Bianca studied him for a long moment. A man like him had no reason to be here, no reason to seek her out. And yet, here he was. She didn't know what to make of it. But for some reason, she wasn't telling him to leave. Bianca didn't know how it happened, but Zane had become a constant presence in her life. It started with him dropping by the diner more often, always finding a reason to be there when she worked. Then, he began walking her to her car after her shifts, insisting it wasn't safe for her to be alone at night. She told him she could handle herself, but he didn't listen. And, strangely, she didn't mind. One evening, as she wiped down the counter before closing, she caught sight of him waiting outside. He leaned casually against his car, hands in his pockets, watching her through the window. The streetlights cast a soft glow on his features, highlighting the quiet patience in his expression. She stepped outside, shivering slightly as the cool air wrapped around her. You really don't have to keep doing this, she said, stopping in front of him. I know, Zane replied, his voice low and steady, but I want to. Something about the way he said it made her breath hitch. He wasn't just being polite, wasn't offering out of obligation. He meant it. Bianca studied him, searching for the catch, the ulterior motive, but she found nothing except sincerity. You're impossible, she murmured. His lips curved just slightly. So I've been told. She exhaled, shaking her head, but there was no real fight left in her. Let's go. He opened the passenger door for her, and for once, she didn't argue. As he drove, the city lights stretched out before them, casting a soft golden hue over the streets. A comfortable silence settled between them, neither feeling the need to fill it. After a while, Zane spoke. Tell me something about you that no one else knows. Bianca glanced at him. What? He kept his eyes on the road, but there was curiosity in his tone. Something real, something you don't tell just anyone. She hesitated. Letting people in had never been easy for her. But Zane had a way of making her feel safe. She exhaled, staring out the window. When I was little, I used to dream about leaving this city, going somewhere no one knew me, starting fresh. Zane was quiet for a moment before he asked, and why didn't you? She let out a soft, humorless laugh. Life gets in the way. He didn't press, didn't demand more than she was willing to give. Instead, he simply said, maybe it's not too late. His words settled deep in her chest, stirring something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Hope. She turned to look at him, and for the first time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, Zane was different. The night air hummed softly as Zane's car rolled to a stop in front of Bianca's apartment building. The street was quiet, save for the occasional flicker of a distant street lamp. A gentle tension filled the space between them, something unspoken lingering in the cool air. Bianca hesitated before reaching for the door handle. Every time they parted, it felt harder to leave. She had spent so much of her life keeping people at arm's length, but Zane had a way of slipping past the walls she had built. She turned to face him. His gaze was steady, waiting, as if sensing the thoughts running through her mind. You keep showing up, she muttered, more to herself than anything. Zane leaned slightly toward her, resting his arm on the steering wheel. And you keep letting me. She swallowed, her pulse skittering at the quiet certainty in his voice. He wasn't asking for anything, wasn't pushing, just stating a fact that she couldn't deny. A beat of silence passed before he spoke again. Come with me tomorrow. Bianca blinked. Where? Somewhere outside the city, just for the day. She frowned, searching his face for the reason behind the invitation. Why? Zane exhaled, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. Because, think you need to see that there's more out there than this. His words settled deep, stirring something she had long buried. The idea of escape had always seemed like a childish fantasy, something out of reach. But the way he said it made it sound like a possibility, not a dream. She hesitated, torn between instinct and the unfamiliar pull of wanting something more. Finally, she nodded. "All right," she said softly. A flicker of something close to satisfaction passed over Zane's face, but he didn't gloat. He simply nodded, as if he had known all along that she would say yes. "Good," he murmured. Bianca exhaled, gripping the door handle again. "I should go." Zane didn't argue, but as she stepped out, he called after her. "Get some rest, Bianca." She paused, looking back at him. For a second, she thought about saying something, anything to explain the strange warmth spreading through her chest. Instead, she just gave a small nod before closing the door behind her. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, she realized something unsettling. She was looking forward to tomorrow. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the city as Bianca stepped out of her apartment, her heart pounding with anticipation she wasn't ready to admit. Zane was already waiting for her by his car, leaning against the sleek vehicle with an effortless ease that made him look like he belonged in a world far removed from hers. She hesitated for a moment, taking in the way he watched her approach. There was something about him, something steady, unwavering. He wasn't a man who second-guessed himself, and yet, around her, there was a quiet patience she hadn't expected. Without a word, he opened the passenger door for her. She slid inside, inhaling the faint scent of leather and something distinctly him as he took his seat beside her. As they pulled onto the highway, the towering buildings of the city slowly faded behind them, giving way to open roads and stretches of countryside Bianca had almost forgotten existed. For a while, they rode in silence, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. It wasn't uncomfortable, if anything. It felt natural, like they didn't need to fill the quiet with unnecessary words. Then Zane spoke. "You ever think about leaving?" Bianca glanced at him, caught off guard by the question. "Leaving where?" "The city, the life you know." She exhaled, turning her gaze to the road ahead. "When I was younger, yes, but thinking about it and actually doing it are two different things." Zane was quiet for a moment before replying. "What if told you it didn't have to be?" She frowned, looking at him again. "Are you trying to fix my life, Zane?" A slight smile touched his lips, but his voice remained serious. "No, but am trying to show you that you have options." Bianca didn't know how to respond to that. No one had ever made her feel like she had choices before. Her life had always been about survival, about taking what she could get and making the best of it. She wasn't sure what to do with the idea that there could be more. Before she could dwell on it, Zane made a turn down a narrow road, leading them to a secluded area nestled between rolling hills. The sight took her breath away, a vast expanse of green stretching endlessly beneath a sky so blue it looked almost unreal. He pulled the car to a stop near a small wooden dock by a glistening lake. The water was still, reflecting the sky like a mirror. Bianca stepped out, taking a deep breath. The air was fresher here, untouched by the weight of the city. Zane watched her, his expression unreadable. "I used to come here when I needed to think." She turned to him, curiosity sparking. "Think about what?" "Everything." He walked toward the dock, hands in his pockets. "When I was younger, I didn't have much. I used to sit here and imagine the life I wanted, the kind of future I could build." Bianca followed him, the planks of the dock creaking beneath her feet. "And did it turn out the way you imagined?" Zane exhaled, looking out over the water. "In some ways, in others, not yet." She studied him, realizing for the first time that despite his wealth and confidence, there was still something unfinished about him, like he was searching for something he hadn't quite found. "You talk like you're still waiting for something," she murmured. His gaze flicked to her, something intense simmering beneath the surface. Maybe am. The air between them shifted, thick with something unspoken. Bianca's pulse quickened, but she didn't look away. Zane stepped closer, his voice quieter now. I don't do this. She frowned. Do what? Chase after people, let them in. His eyes searched hers, as if trying to figure out why she was different. But with you, I can't seem to stop. Bianca's breath caught. No one had ever said anything like that to her before, not with this much conviction. You don't even know me, she whispered. Zane reached out, his fingers brushing against hers, a simple touch that sent a shiver down her spine. I know enough. She could have pulled away. She could have reminded him that they came from different worlds, that this, whatever this was, made no sense. But she didn't. Instead, she let herself believe, just for a moment, that maybe, for the first time in her life, someone saw her. Really saw her. And that terrified her more than anything.